Here's what's coming up on The World Today. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky accuses Russia of nuclear terror and calls for sanctions against Russia's nuclear terrorism. China releases white paper reiterating Taiwan is part of China. Plus, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un declares victory in the country's battle against COVID-19. Well, welcome to our viewers here in Nigeria and around the world. I'm Amarachi Ubani, and you're watching Channels Television. We begin with developments in the Russian invasion of Ukraine over the last couple of hours. First off, head of the Moscow-installed regional administration in Zaporizhia says radiation levels around the nuclear plant remains normal after Kyiv and Moscow accused each other of striking the facility. This is coming after Ukraine's state energy company Energoatom says the nuclear power complex was shelled again, putting the blame on Russian forces that seized the area in March. Energoatom says the plant's area was struck 5 times, including near the site where radioactive materials are stored, but that no one was injured and the situation at the place remains under control. Meanwhile, Ukraine's special envoy for the Middle East is warning Arab countries against what he calls Russian meddling in regional affairs, accusing Moscow of sending mercenaries to the region in order to plan coups and plunder these countries' wealth. The envoy, Maxim Subuk, made an address to the Arab League via video conference weeks after the group hosted Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and also blamed Moscow for preventing Ukrainian wheat deliveries to the region. Finally, the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has called for immediate end to military activity near the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine and to not target its facilities or surrounding. We had President Volodymyr Zelensky calling on Western countries to support Ukraine's war efforts with weapons, money and sanctions against what he called Russia's nuclear terrorism. President Zelensky made the comments after Russia and Ukraine accused each other this week of shelling the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant currently under Russian occupation. He accused Russia of holding nuclear power stations hostage and firing cruise missiles over Ukraine's nuclear power plants, and also called for sanctioning of Russia's nuclear industry, including the nuclear state enterprise Rosatom. In the meantime, Britain and Denmark say they will provide more financial and military aid to Ukraine, making the pledges as European defense ministers met in Copenhagen today to discuss long-term support for the country's defense against Russia's invasion. The Danish Prime Minister said his country will increase its financial aid to Ukraine by 110 million euros. Britain, which already has donated advanced weapon systems to Ukraine and given thousands of its troops military training, says it will send more multiple launch rocket systems. But back to President Volodymyr Zelensky. He's promised Ukraine will respond to the Russian shelling of a town and needs to consider how to inflict as much damage on Russia as possible to end the war quickly. Ukrainian officials say 13 people died and 10 were wounded when Russia fired rockets at Marinets from the territory of a nuclear power plant it is captured in the Dnipropetrovsk region. Attack, is said, outlined the need for allies to supply more powerful weapons to the Ukrainian military. But unilateral sanctions imposed by the United States and Western countries against Russia will not bring peace, but will only isolate themselves. And the short-sighted policy will also expose the European countries to very severe challenges, so says co-founder of the Transnational Foundation for Peace and Future Research in Lund, Sweden, Jan Oberg. Oberg says the European countries are paying a heavy price, such as price hikes and social turmoils, by imposing sanctions on Russia, and these sufferings are brought by the US-led NATO rather than Russia.
26 countries, as well as the European Union, have met here in Copenhagen and have sent a clear signal. Ukraine's fight is our fight. We stand together and we stand with Ukraine. We condemn Russia's brutal attack in the strongest possible way, and we will continue to assist Ukraine in its military needs. In total, participants today have committed more than 1.5 billion euros to the table for Ukraine.
I am satisfied with the conference and with the results. A lot of information is classified, so I cannot discuss it openly, but we reached clear initiatives and commitments on demining. We agreed upon long-term and mid-term activity. These terms are also related to armaments production, and I am glad that we all have common sense that there is no time for fatigue. That is marathon. For marathon, you need energy, and frankly speaking, the main energy in this case is money. Our partners know that we need funding, and they articulated readiness to support us financially.
But it is also the case that Russia are starting to fail in many areas. They have failed so far and are unlikely to ever succeed in occupying Ukraine. Their invasion has faltered and constantly been remodified to the extent they are really only focusing in parts of the south and in the east, a long, long way away from their three-day so-called special operation. 3 days are now over 150 days and nearly 6 months in.
The Danish Prime Minister, the Swedish representative of the Swedish government, as well as Britain, on their remarks about financial and military aid to Ukraine earlier today at a meeting in Copenhagen. Now, while efforts are being made to get Ukrainian and Russian officials back to the negotiating table for peace talks, Russia has ruled out any attempts by Switzerland. The Russian Foreign Ministry today said Switzerland could not represent Ukrainian interests in Russia and Moscow's interests in Ukraine because it no longer is a neutral country. The Foreign Ministry representative told reporters Switzerland unfortunately has lost its status of neutral country and can be neither a mediator nor representative of interests. It's known that Bern joined illegal Western sanctions against Russia. It supports anti-national Nazi regime in Kyiv, participates in aggressive Russophobic campaign organized by Western Ukraine. It's absolutely unclear how can Bern offer to be a mediator, representative or other kind services with this kind of attitude. Well, Russian military strikes on Ukrainian cities have increased in recent weeks. Here's a report on this week's latest so far.
Pro-Russian separatists have accused the Ukrainian forces of shelling a brewery in the occupied city of Donetsk, killing one person and triggering a leak of ammonia on Wednesday night. The Emergencies Ministry in the Russian-backed self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic says a shell hit an ammonia line late at night, sparking a fire that at one point covered 600 square meters. Flames were seen lighting the sky above one part of the city, as well as firefighters donning masks. In another clip, a corpse is seen on the ground. Over in the Kharkiv region, Ukraine's National Guard servicemen used anti-craft cannon against Russian troops. One of the servicemen and one of the anti-aircraft guns crew says it was unusual use of the weapon. Ukraine, which has stepped up its drive to retake Russian-controlled regions in the south, said last week it saw evidence Moscow was redeploying its forces to defend the captured territory. Meanwhile, Ukrainian officials say Russia is attacking scores of civilian and military targets in its bid to establish full control over Ukraine's Luhansk and Donetsk regions in the east, with 120 rockets hitting the area around the town of Nikopol overnight. Dnipropetrovsk governor Valentin Rezhenko said on Instagram that 3 people were killed and 7 wounded by shelling in Nikopol when 120 grade rockets hit the area. And as President Volodymyr Zelensky says plans are underway for a major counter-offensive to retake the southwestern city of Kherson, Ukrainian officials are encouraging residents living in areas around an imminent huge battle to flee. However, some Ukrainians are reluctant to leave their homes. Many homes in the region have been blighted by Russian shelling. Locals say officials are telling them to leave, as it is risky for residents to live so close to the front line. Finally, satellite images have been released showing damages made to the Russian Seki air base in Crimea. One senior Ukrainian official suggested a series of explosions at the Seki air base in Crimea could have been the work of partisan saboteurs, as Kiev denies any responsibility for the incident deep inside Russian-occupied territory.
The VOA's Anna Chernikova joins us now. Anna, let's begin with the latest attacks and this back and forth with the attacks and counterattacks, especially around the Zaporizhzhia power plant. Is the plant still under protection of Russian forces?
Good evening. Well, it's difficult to say that Zaporizhzhia power plant is under protection. It's under Russian control of the Russian forces. However, international society and International Atomic Energy Agency urges Russia to allow access for control, because Ukrainian officials cannot get access to the site, and similarly international international atomic energy officials as well. So for the moment, we know, and just in information, that it was the fourth shelling of the Zaporizhzhia power plant just during today. Russian forces unfortunately continue to shell the territory. We know that the latest shelling hit the territory very close to the first power block, and this is extremely dangerous. 3 previous shelling also hit the territory of the power plant, particularly the pumping station and fire station next to the power plant. So it's all of this is very close to each other. The reason for that, of course, we cannot know for sure, but today we know that it will be a UN meeting on this case, and unfortunately, Russian forces are just showing that. Probably they are, I don't know, trying to highlight that this case is still under quite a dangerous situation, and the air raid siren is on again while we're speaking. So, it could be a sign of some additional attacks. In general, if we look at the territory of Ukraine, most of attacks continue to happen in the south, in particularly Mykolaiv region, also Zaporizhzhia region and Zaporizhzhia power plant specifically. We also see the attacks in Kharkiv region and Donbas. Donbas remains a very hot spot in line with Kherson region.
President Zelensky today, or probably last night, I think it's today though, did say countries should regard Russia, he referred to Russia's nuclear terrorism, and that's because of the attacks close enough to Zaporizhzhia. Who are the allies with him on this?
As we heard already, the report and the announcement from the International Atomic Energy Agency that at least Russia has to give access, because this organization basically confirms that Russia put this biggest in Europe atomic power plant at risk, nuclear power plant at risk, and international community, international leaders continue to repeat this thesis as well, that Russia should give back the control for this plant for Ukraine. So I guess we can consider this as the alliances with Ukraine and with Ukrainian president in particular, because here in Ukraine, and President Zelensky has already mentioned it a lot of times, people have an experience of such kind of catastrophes, like, Chernobyl and people understand how dangerous it is, and people understand what consequences it can bring, and taking into consideration that this power plant is the biggest in Europe and it's much bigger than Chernobyl. If anything happened there, it will be a very bad consequence, not only for Ukraine, but also for Europe, and maybe even for the whole world. It will only depend on the wind and on the weather conditions. So international community definitely understand the danger, the risks, and as we can see from what we hear and from the official rhetorics, Ukrainian international community, in particularly yesterday G7 representatives of the ministers of G7 countries encouraged once again Russia to give back control to Ukraine of this plant. And I guess we can consider this as a sign of support for Ukraine and Ukrainian president in this particular case.
Yeah, and 120 rockets and a hit in Luhansk and Donetsk regions of Ukraine. Officials are saying Russian forces have been targeting scores of civilians and military targets. Why is it difficult to prove, though, that Russia is behind those attacks? Because they keep, denying that. Moscow did recognize these regions as autonomous, right?
Yes, just before the invasion, the full-scale invasion, Russia recognized these territories as autonomous. Neither Ukraine nor other countries did so. I mean, European countries and the US. It's not really difficult for experts to particularly, say who is responsible for the shelling or for the particular attack, because analysis is always going with the use of satellites and with the analysis of how the rocket hit, from which side, and so on and so forth. Of course, Russia denies, and Russia did not, never basically confirmed that they are responsible for any of the attacks. But Ukrainian officials, military officials, usually provide satellite images and international intelligence reports in support of their own reports. So for Ukraine and for international society, usually there is no question who is responsible for particular attacks. Of course, there are some attacks when it's not possible to independently verify or to check. But in general, usually satellite images and intelligence reports, which are not only Ukrainian, of course, usually create the whole picture. And unfortunately, we see confirmed information from various sources that Russian forces shell a lot of civilian areas, especially in Donbas, because for the moment they're trying to advance and they haven't succeeded for the past weeks.
Has Ukraine been conducting counterattacks on Russian targets as well?
Yes, definitely. And Ukrainian military officials confirmed that, and President Zelensky himself confirmed that, especially in Kherson region. And we hear a lot about counteroffensive actions. And yesterday, President Zelensky, not only yesterday, in the previous days, and also Minister of Defense, all the Ukrainian officials, basically, they have the same rhetoric and the same information that Ukraine will continue to the counteroffensive actions. And actually, everyone are expecting some, advances, but of course, we're never going to get any details on the dates or time when this, actions should happen. But definitely, we hear that, for example, for the past day, Ukrainian forces proceeded with certain attacks in Kherson region, destroying some military bases and military equipment, warehouses on the occupied territories of Kherson region. So we hear a lot of that, and we hear similar things that are happening at Donbas region. So definitely, Ukrainian army is is also advancing at certain areas and trying to advance and proceeding with the attacks. This is not just defending war at the moment.
Anna, thank you so much for your reports, and do stay safe.
Thank you.
Still watching The World Today. Coming up after the break. China shows off a new type of ship-borne unmanned helicopter as it makes its maiden flight in Jiangxi province. Stay with us. Welcome back to The World Today. British police have charged a 38-year-old man with terrorism offences after he was deported to England from Turkey. Prosecutors said they had originally authorized the charging of Ain Davis, who is accused of being a member of an Islamic State cell dubbed the Beatles under terrorism laws in 2014. After being deported by Turkish authorities, he was arrested on his arrival at Luton Airport. He will appear in a London court this morning. He must have already appeared, but this cell was called the Beatles by hostages in Syria because of their British accents. Davis has denied being part of the group. Let's turn to China now. The Navy has conducted a 3-day live fire drill at the South China Sea, aiming to temper sailors' cooperative combat capabilities in complicated conditions. The drill was carried out in a squadron that is under the Southern Theater Command of PLA Navy and was formed with Mianyang and Luoyang frigates. After the squadron sailed to the designated waters, the drill started upon receiving the information about the so-called enemy vessel. The squadron trained itself for the sea in combat formation, making comprehensive judgments on targets and conducting missile firing while evading missiles from so-called enemy vessels. The squadron also focused on the coordinated command and emergency management and trained on replenishment at sea, sailing and handling of unexpected situations. Well, the Theater Command of the PLA Navy, Guanbo, says China set up plots in the drill as the occasion required, tempered and trained the troops in danger and crisis, and effectively tested the results of previous training. Next, China will continue to forge targeted training on key subjects and ensure the troops to be ready for real combat at all times. Showing off its new military acquisition, China has shown off a ship-borne unmanned helicopter developed by the Aviation Industry Corporation during its maiden flight recently in Poyang County of East China, Jiangxi province. During the flight, the aircraft, the AR-500CJ, completed training courses, including manned takeoff, landing, hovering, and landed smoothly. The aircraft is said to be in good condition and all systems were functioning normally, marking its official entry into the test flight phase from the design and production phase. The AR-500CJ, developed by a research institute of the AVIC, is an update version of AR-500BJ, a lightweight ship-borne unmanned helicopter that can be used for both military and civilian applications such as maritime search and rescue. Compared with the AR-500BJ, the new type AR-500CJ's flight performance and mission have been comprehensively improved with a series of technological breakthroughs. The aircraft will undergo functional and performance test flights in China and is planned to pass technical appraisal next year. On the ground, China still insists the peaceful reunification under the one country, two systems principle will bring tangible benefits to the people of Taiwan as it released a white paper titled The Taiwan Question and China's Reunification in the New Era. A white paper published by the Taiwan Affairs Office of the State Council and the State Council Information Office on Wednesday comprehensively elaborates on the position, principles and policies of the Communist Party of China and the Chinese government on advancing and realizing national reunification in the new era. One commentator speaking on the paper on national TV said it is important that it proposed a solution of Taiwan question, peaceful reunification. Communication is needed in solving the issues between Taiwan and the mainland, but the ultimate goal is realizing reunification through one country, two systems. The approach and trend of one country, two systems will certainly take into consideration the broad feelings of the Taiwan people. The fifth part of the white paper talked about the bright prospects for peaceful reunification. He says he thinks that this part is more important for forecasting that people in Taiwan will enjoy broader space in various activities and career development. In addition, he said Taiwan will enjoy growing presence in the international arena and organizations and make more contributions. It clearly is the mainland's solemn commitment to Taiwan, he says. But the Taiwanese president, Tsai Ing-wen, says the threat of force from China has not abated, but Taiwan will not escalate conflict or provoke disputes. She made the remark today when she visited the island nation's Air Force Operations Command Office. President Tsai described herself as deeply touched by military efforts to defend the self-ruled island. And in her words, we will firmly defend our sovereignty and national security and fastidiously defend democracy and freedom. Away from China now, the sister of North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un says he suffered a fever during the COVID-19 pandemic in what appears to be the first suggestion that he had the virus. Kim Yo-jong also blames South Korea for her country's outbreaks and has sent leaflets contaminated with COVID across the border. South Korea has rejected the claims as groundless. Ms. Kim was speaking as her brother declared victory in the country's battle against COVID. The secretive nation announced its first COVID outbreak in May this year and has reported fever, infections and deaths since. But there is widespread doubt over the data, especially the low number of deaths. Heaviest rain in Seoul in 115 years has spurred a South Korean capital to revive a $1.5 billion plan to improve drainage after floods exposed how even the affluent Gangnam district is vulnerable to climate change-driven extreme weather. Experts say the city's capacity to drain water is far behind what's needed to handle the deluge, or like the one suffered this week. This had disastrous implications for low-lying areas like Gangnam as these bouts of extreme weather are becoming increasingly common. In the wake of the week's downpour, Seoul's mayor Oh Si-hoon announced the city would spend 1.5 trillion won in the next decade to build 6 massive underground tunnels to store and release rainwater to prevent flooding. The underground tunnels were originally proposed in 2011 after heavy rains and landslides killed 16 people, many of them in Gangnam. But the plan was put on hold amid decreased precipitation and budget issues in the following years. The torrential rain killed at least 11 people across the northern part of the country. It also knocked out power, caused landslides and flooded roads and subways. We're still keeping our eyes on the elections in Kenya as vote counting continues. The official results are still yet awaited 2 days after the general elections. They're still collating those results and are yet to announce who's leading in the presidential race in the East African regional powerhouse. Media houses are trying to do their own tallies, but only have images of results from more than 46,229 polling stations, leading to divergent tallies and public confusion in a very close race between the two front-runners, William Ruto and Raila Odinga. Some Kenyans have voiced their concern that divergent tallies could inflame claims of rigging, which have sparked violence in past elections. Results are also being watched closely, carefully by Kenyans all over the country. Veteran opposition leader Raila Odinga is making his 5th stab at the presidency. He is neck and neck with Deputy President William Ruto. Outgoing President Uhuru Kenyatta has reached his 2-term limit. He's endorsed Odinga for president after falling out with Ruto after the last election. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has expressed serious concerns about the human rights situation in Rwanda after talks with President Paul Kagame in the capital, Kigali. Mr. Blinken says he had raised U.S. concerns about the detention of Paul Rusesabagina, a permanent resident of the United States who is credited with saving hundreds of lives during the Rwandan genocide in 1994. Rusesabagina was sentenced to 25 years in prison after being convicted of terrorism. Blinken says he's also discussed with Rwandan President Paul Kagame. Credible reports that Rwanda continues to support M23 rebel group in the Democratic Republic of Congo. He made the remarks at a joint press conference with Rwanda's foreign minister.
I discussed the credible reports indicating that Rwanda continues to support the M23 rebel group and has its own forces inside the DRC. We recognize that Rwanda has security concerns of its own, including reports of cooperation between the Congolese military and the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda, the DFLR, an armed group. My message to both President Tshisekedi and President Kagame this week has been the same. Any support or cooperation with any armed group in eastern DRC endangers local communities and regional stability. And every country in the region must respect the territorial integrity of the others. The United States has the same message for all neighboring countries. We've seen where the failure to respect these principles can lead in the immeasurable consequences of decades-long conflict in eastern DRC, which has taken the lives of more than 5 million people and displaced millions more. Coming out of the discussions, both presidents have agreed to engage in direct talks with each other. They're both ready to resume the talks in the context of the Nairobi process with armed groups, and both welcome the continued U.S. engagement in support of African-led mediation efforts.
Rwanda is not the cause of long-standing instability in eastern DRC, where we have over 130 armed groups, including the M23. And the presence of the FDLR and the close collaboration with the army of the DRC has always been the most significant cause of insecurity. And this enables the FDLR to conduct terrorist operations on Rwandan territory, something government of Rwanda cannot accept. And Rwanda will always reserve the right to take necessary measures to protect its integrity, its territorial integrity, its sovereignty, and to ensure the security of its people.
Stay with us, more ahead on The World Today. Plus, protests in Sierra Leone as police are also killed in the demonstrations. Join us again. Welcome back. Our tour of Africa continues in Sierra Leone, where police say dozens of civilians and 6 police officers have been killed in anti-government protests. A news agency on the ground puts the number of dead civilians at 21, citing multiple sources. It also says smoke clouds and tear gas can be seen in the capital, a free town where large crowds have been throwing rocks, burning tires, and armed officers are patrolling the streets. Hundreds of people have been taking part in the demonstrations in Freetown and in places such as Makeni and Kamakwi in the opposition's northern stronghold because they're fed up with the high cost of living, corruption, and police brutality. Police, however, say a nighttime curfew has been imposed on the city and it will remain in place even today. Still on the continent, which is home to more than 2,000 native languages, few of which can be found in translation apps and dictionaries. That could soon change, and that's because Google and other tech companies are making use of machine learning and artificial intelligence to incorporate such languages and their dialects into widely accessible translation software.
Kampala resident Hussein Bamau, who grew up in Uganda's capital city but is originally from India, long struggled to find resources to study the languages he hears on street corners. Bamau has fought a lifelong battle to understand Luganda, Uganda's official language, that despite being spoken by millions across the East African country, is not taught in schools. But as of this year, the aspiring polyglots can now copy-paste learning materials into Google's translation service and read them directly in Luganda.
After that announcement, I was really excited because being here in East Africa and growing up not having enough resources to learn Luganda myself, it was exciting for me because as I finally now know that there's a translator app available. Yes, we have Luganda dictionaries in bookshops and things like that, but there are very few resources on the internet. So there are some Luganda Luganda handbooks and some material, very little material online to learn Luganda, but there's not a proper translation app or service which we can use. So that's amazing.
Google's new feature is part of a push to widen representation and reduce bias in artificial intelligence systems. Translation and language learning giants like Google and Duolingo have joined non-profit-led efforts to expand language databases available online. Luganda was one of 24 languages added to Google Translate last month, spoken by around 300 million people. The new batch includes 10 sub-Saharan African languages, while the rest are mainly used in India and among indigenous groups in South America. There are now 23 African languages on the platform, up from 13, although they still only account for 17% of the total.
Some of these languages are really hard to find a lot of data online and have one-to-one translation from English to that language, because these are really, like, many of them are very traditional or local languages. So what they did is they used a monolingual approach where they use machine learning and artificial intelligence to make use of all this data and then kind of create these models which help with the translation of such languages which don't have a lot of material of them online. So it's really cool in terms of technology. As a technologist myself, I really admire the way they've done it.
The trend is spreading. Duolingo, which currently offers 8 underrepresented languages out of 40, is working to add Zulu and Xhosa, spoken by 20 million people, mainly in South Africa, later this year.
French officials say 1,000 firefighters are battling a monster fire southwest of France. It's already destroyed nearly 7,000 hectares of forest. The raging blaze near the city of Bordeaux has gutted a number of homes and forced 10,000 residents to flee. According to one media station, it's an ogre, it's a monster, according to a firefighter who was speaking there. Strong winds and high temperatures are hampering the firefighting operation. President Emmanuel Macron announced that Austria, Germany, Greece, Poland and Romania are coming to aid France in battling the blaze. This summer, France and a number of other European countries have seen a wave of deadly fires, triggered by record temperatures and droughts across the continent. More than 1,000 deaths have been attributed to the heat in Portugal and Spain. Swiss Army helicopters have been drafted in to airlift water to thousands of thirsty farm animals who are sweltering under the summer soaring temperatures in the country's alpine meadows. Lower rainfall this year forced farmers to call in the army, swoop in with much-needed refreshments for their animals to prevent this year's drought. causing feed shortages later in the year. A 2-week operation is now underway with 3 Super Puma helicopters flying to refill the near-empty reservoirs used by farmers for their cows, whose milk is often used to make cheese and other animals like pigs and goats. 6 helicopters have been mobilized for the efforts, which will run until August 19. Overall, some 400,000 litres of water can be delivered in the operation, which was also carried out during the droughts of 2015 and in 2018. Well, Mexico also stands the risk of losing animals due to the drought there, deprived of water in one of the worst droughts the country has seen for 30 years. Just 10% of Mexico's dams are now full, with many seeing levels drop below half or lower, according to official data. This month of July was the second hottest month in Mexico since 1953. That's according to the National Weather Service. Temperatures reached 45 degrees Celsius last month in some areas. Agricultural towns like Coyame, which do not have access to groundwater and are almost entirely dependent on the region's shrinking dam, have been devastated. The town's cattle have been depleted, harvests disrupted, and fisheries culled, forcing some workers to move to the cities. In recent weeks, rainfall from the American monsoon has provided some relief in Chihuahua, but farmers say it's not enough. In mid-July, the Mexican government declared a national emergency and announced initiatives to prevent companies like Coca-Cola and Heineken extracting so much water in the north. There have also been water caps on households in the northern industrial city of Monterrey. Nonetheless, the crisis has persisted and has sparked protests and roadblocks around the city. We're in the Middle East as a hostage standoff, which a gunman demanded a Beirut bank let him withdraw his trapped savings, has ended with the man's surrender and thankfully no injuries. Authorities say 42-year-old Bassem al-Sheikh Hussein entered the federal bank in Beirut's bustling Hamra district with a shotgun and a canister of gasoline, threatening to set himself on fire unless he was allowed to take out his money. After hours of negotiations, he accepted an offer from the bank to receive part of his savings. And there were also discussions with him and the police before he was released. He then released hostages who were held in the bank because he wanted to get his money, and then he surrendered himself. Well, he did not actually receive any of the money, according to a lawyer who took part in the negotiations. His wife, Maryam, who was standing outside, told reporters after his arrest that her husband did what he had to do. Hussein was holding at least 6 bank employees hostage, according to an official who spoke on the condition of anonymity in line with regulations much earlier today. He had fired 3 warning shots into the air. Reported has about $200 stuck in the bag. And thankfully, no one was hurt. However, 3 people have died, 39 houses damaged after a massive house explosion rocked a neighborhood in Evansville, Indiana, in the United States. Local media say that there could be other victims still unaccounted for from the explosion. A spokesperson for the police says 39 homes were damaged from the blast, leaving 11 of them uninhabitable. Authorities have urged residents to stay clear of the area. No one knows the cause of the explosion, and an investigation is ongoing.
The shake of the explosion it felt like an earthquake, another way to put it.
We just hear a crazy boom and our whole house shakes. And so we immediately ran outside because we didn't know what happened.
Seen down south of Wambach from us, explosion, materials, some houses, people were laying on the ground.
Well, every little helps for Ukraine. Artists from the country and in the US are transforming a heap of burnt-out cars destroyed in the early days of Russia's war in the country with brilliant sunflowers. Look at it there. The project has drawn some fire from those who say it is wrong to create beauty out of the wreckage of war. But the artists insist their work has been sanctioned by city leaders who will help Ukrainian artists in overall rebuilding efforts. Muralist Trek Kelly from Los Angeles said the response had been overwhelmingly positive, including from one couple whose car was in the pile who thanked them for repurposing these cars into something more beautiful. Authorities had also assured the artists that no human lives were lost in those cars, most of which were moved from a nearby bridge destroyed by Ukrainian forces to halt the advance of Russian tanks shortly after the February 24 invasion.
The project is about raising money for Ukrainian artists and collaborating with them and cooperating with cities who will designate for us the appropriate walls that they wish to be beautified, some in very damaged areas, specifically because they want to beautify those areas for people's spirits until they can rebuild. And then we're making NFTs out of the murals so that they can be sold to help fund local humanitarian.
That's right, the collective will sell their works as digital assets to raise money for local causes. Speaking of art, a Brazilian woman, Sabine Cole-Borrichi, has been arrested on allegations she was part of a bizarre scheme to defraud her 82-year-old mother, the wife of the late art collector Jean Borrichi, out of money, artwork and jewelry totaling some 724 million reais. That's over $142 million. Her arrest has exposed a disturbing web of fraud the police say lasted years and involved alleged psychics to swindle artwork by some of Brazil's most emblematic painters. 4 other people were also arrested. 2 others, Diana Aparadice and Slavko Vuletic, are on the run. Well, that scam began in 2020 when Genevieve was approached by a supposed psychic with prophecies of her daughter's imminent death. A victim was then taken to several more psychics who police say used personal information provided by her daughter to scam her distraught mother into transferring money to pay for so-called spiritual treatment.
O golpe começou a ser executado em...
We'll keep your eyes open out there. Thanks for watching. I'm Amarachi Ubani.